Good morning and welcome to our webinar. Before we start, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping rules. The chat function has been disabled and we kindly ask that participants direct all questions in the Q&A box. And this webinar is being recorded as well as live streamed to our Facebook page and will be available for viewing and sharing after on the project's YouTube channel and Facebook page. The links will be shared in the chat. We hope that you do enjoy our webinar today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to hand over to Dr. Marissa Gowrie, who's the Deputy Environmental Manager at the Ministry of Planning and Development's Environmental Policy and Planning Division, as well as the National Ozone Officer. Dr. Gowrie.
Thank you very much, Erica. Just making sure that you can hear me well.
Loud and clear.
Lovely. So a warm welcome to you all this morning at our very exciting webinar. This all forms part of the work of the Environmental Policy and Planning Division of the Ministry of Planning and Development. And the main focus of the Environmental Policy and Planning Division is to ensure implementation of policy and programs that guide the sustainable development of Trinidad and Tobago. So back in 2020, early 2020, approval was obtained for the largest ever grant-funded national project under the Global Environmental Facility, or GEF. And this project was entitled Energy Efficiency through the Development of Low-Carbon Refrigeration and Air Conditioning, or we call it RAC, technologies in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, the overall goal of this US $5.152 million four-year project, of which implementation is facilitated by the United Nations Development Programme, is to create a sustained market change towards the adoption of low carbon refrigeration and air conditioning technologies in our country. And we hope that this will deliver multiple benefits at the local, regional, and global levels. So I just wanted to share some areas of action under this project. And of course, this is by no means all of it, but just wanted to share some of it with you. So through this project, we are hoping that we would have promotion of not-in-kind refrigeration and air conditioning technologies, such as cooling as a service. And we envisage that this would provide incredible opportunities for the private sector, both in terms of reducing costs and offering commercial air conditioning as a profitable service. And then we hope, of course, that this be expanded to reducing national energy demand, particularly when paired with renewable energy solutions. Some other things we're doing is in terms of energy efficient building design as a factor in building regulations. And we're hoping that through the impetus that we're creating in this project, that we would really look towards ranging from manufacturing or assembling energy efficient rack equipment and lighting to manufacturing construction materials for building insulation. And all of this in an effort to prevent the loss of cooling. So all of this obviously is to promote energy efficient building design. And we're also hoping to establish minimum energy performance standards through other regulatory agencies that exist, such as the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. And we're hoping that this would also be incorporated towards refrigerant air conditioning equipment, as well as energy labeling standards, and really to establish a baseline for the energy ratings for rack equipment that are sold on the local market, all towards ensuring that consumers can make better informed purchasing decisions. So these are just some of the things that the project is aiming to do. And through various activities in the project, we've been having webinars to educate our stakeholders on how they can become involved in the various aspects that they are engaged in to really help us achieve the goals of this project. So we are this morning going to be chatting about sustainable financing mechanisms for energy efficiency. And on behalf of the ministry, we would like to deeply thank our two presenters who will be sharing their knowledge and expertise with us this morning. So with those few words, I don't want to take up too much time. I'll pass it back over to our facilitator to guide us through this morning's webinar. So welcome again, and I hope that you enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. I am Janelle Huggins, and I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Mr. Dimitri Karamistos. He is a Senior Energy Efficiency Business Developer Specialist at the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy. He has 13 years of experience in the energy sector, technology, and entrepreneurship in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He's an engineer and business developer with a focus on energy and sustainability. Dimitris has been co-leading the base cooling as a service Energy Efficiency as a Service and SET Alliance programs, which aims to unlock investments in clean and efficient solutions through the disrupting servitization business model. And our moderator for this morning is Mr. Andrew Dalep Jr. He's an attorney at law and consultant in environmental law, anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. His 24-year career includes experience in all stages of development of environmental law and policy, criminal prosecution, and civil litigation. He served as Registrar of the Environmental Commission from 2002 and from 2014 as Special Legal Advisor to the Attorney General. Since 2018, he has served as a consultant on multiple UNDP and FAO projects and is currently serving as a legal expert on the project Energy Efficiency through the development of low carbon RAC technologies. Also, Andrew currently serves as a consultant to national authorities in Trinidad and Tobago and the Americas region on anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. He holds the degrees of Bachelor of Laws and Honors and Masters of Science of Distinction in Science for Management of Tropical Environments, as well as he's a certified anti-money laundering specialist, a certified global sanctions specialist, and advanced CAMS audit designations, and is a certified assessor under the FATF fourth round methodology. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite our guest speaker, Mr. Dimitri Karmistos, to present his presentation for today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jenny, for this introduction. And thanks as well for the invitation today to have the opportunity to present the work we've been doing within Cooling as a Service to accelerate the deployment of clean and energy efficient cooling solutions across the globe, and as well as an entity to showcase a little bit our efforts to accelerate our path to a more climate resilient future. So without further ado, I'll share my screen. Let me know if you can see my screen, and I will go in full presentation mode.
Yes, we can see it.
Super. So before anything, let me share a few words to the audience on the agency I work for. So the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, we are a nonprofit foundation based in Switzerland. We were founded 20 years ago by the Swiss government, the city of Basel, and we are a specialized partner of the UN Environment Programme. And our core focus, vision, and expertise has been for many years to design innovative financial mechanisms and business models that help accelerate investments and the deployment of energy efficient solutions, renewable energy, and also climate-driven solutions. So we work really as an entity between a set of key stakeholders that go from companies in the private sector, really like technology-focused companies, to as well the public sector, to development agencies, to banks and other financial institutions, to really create this type of financial mechanisms that then hopefully and ideally, if they're properly designed, really grow sustainably within a specific market. And then we always try to replicate those models across different geographies and industries. So some of the work and areas that we focus on goes like I mentioned previously, on renewable energy, energy efficiency, but as well energy access, electric mobility. So for instance, for the audience to know, we did a project in Colombia where the aim was to implement a huge fleet of electric buses in the city of Medellin. And today, so the initial target was to implement 500 electric buses. And today the city implemented 1,500 electric buses. And actually the financial model we implemented within, it's the model that you will see today. So it's a mixture between of batteries being used as the servitization model. So a pay-per-use consumption of the batteries of the buses, whereas the structure of the buses, so the skeleton of the buses was under a leasing program. So the government could really also compare apple to apple the advantage of engaging with the electric bus rather than going with diesel buses. And then we do also a lot of work, of course, on climate finance, adaptation and resilience, land use, and circular economy, which I will be touching a little bit on today because it's very much connected to the model that you will see on cooling as a service. So very briefly, where we act is really we are having projects around the world, from Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, the African continent, Asia, and also starting now in North America. And so that was very brief, and I'll quickly jump into the core of the topic. That is really the model we designed on cooling as a service. But before explaining a few words on the model, I'll take a step back and briefly explain why, as a foundation, we focused for the past 3 years as well a lot on the cooling industry. And the audience probably knows some of these figures. Is first of all, the cooling industry is really the backbone of our day-to-day lives. So it's representing approximately 10% of global energy consumption today. And this consumption is set to triple in the next 30 years. And so this is a growth that we cannot really stop. It's connected to GDP growth, of course, population growth, but as well climate growth. And so climate temperature rise, but as well knowledge of accessibility to certain technologies. So from one side, of course, this represents a huge financial opportunity of more than 6.9 trillion US dollars over the next 30 years. But as well, unfortunately, it represents a huge risk on the climate. And what we see from data that is actually available from the IEA is that unfortunately businesses, whether it is that you look straightly into a business or a private individual, we all engage with systems that are rather not energy efficient and also using bad chemicals, so refrigerants with high GWP. So what we see from a data perspective is that in general, businesses engage with systems that are 40 to 60% less energy efficient than the best systems they would have access in their respective markets. So of course, this from one end, it's a huge risk on the climate, but on the other as well, it's a massive problem from a grid perspective. So how do you supply energy to an industry that is also highly volatile in energy consumption? And this is also then showing kind of a strong bottleneck to accelerate the deployment of renewables, because renewables are not so reactive in deploying energy than, for instance, a gas plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant. So hence, again, the importance to focus on energy efficiency. And so what we see, especially if you look at the technologies of cooling, is that what is surprising is actually energy efficiency should be extremely appealing. So if you look at the whole life cycle of a system, which typically, let's take on average 12 years, 90% of the cost of the system, if you look at the whole life cycle, is actually the operation and the maintenance cost of the system. So inspection, maintenance, electricity costs, water consumption. So the selling price is just a small fraction. But even though this is happening, like customers are really, really reluctant to engage with more expensive systems. So what we've been looking at the market, and we've been analyzing a little bit the demand barriers of why customers are not engaging with the most energy efficient systems across industries and sectors, is that in general, we see that the first barrier I mentioned is one that comes very often. So the higher upfront investment cost of better technologies is really a hurdle for customers. The second part, which is very important, is the lack of trust in performance. So typically this is a factor that comes not only in cooling, but across a range of technologies. So whenever a solution provider tries to sell an innovative technology, the first question that the customer asks is typically, how many hours of operation does this system have? And the same in the financial sector. If it is to deploy investment into a technology, the first thing we're looking at is, okay, how secure is that investment? How trustable is the performance and the reliability of this technology? And then the third bottleneck is prioritization of investment from customers. So typically, if a customer has a hotel, for instance, they would typically prioritize to make the hotel more appealing to customers rather than investing into a more energy efficient cooling system, which might be 100 or 200K more expensive. And then also, of course, the maintenance is overlooked. So there is a risk on, if I take a more fancy or more innovative system and it breaks down, how am I secure that actually the supply chain is going to be solid enough so that I can get the spare parts in a rapid enough manner. So all of this really slows down the market adaptation of clean and energy efficient cooling solutions. And what we've seen really is the opportunity to bring a solution to the market through the model that we call servitization, which is really what you see here on the graph. It's not a new concept. So it's a concept that has been applied to different sectors in the past. One which is very well known is in the printing sector. So as you know, today companies, they don't buy printing machines, but they pay per amount of paper printed. And the same for actually solar panels. So the deployment of what is named as power purchase agreements is really like a model that enabled the massive growth of solar panels across regions, which is really when customers, instead of buying the solar panels, they just pay the electricity like we would pay it from the grid. And so we took that model and we deployed it in cooling and also actually in heating, lighting, and transport. But today we will focus on cooling. And really, like for the past 2 years, we've seen really an upscale trend of applications and companies applying this model within cooling. So actually, if I should update this graph, cooling is a little bit further up the graph, which is really great to know. So what is the model really? It's a pay-per-use model. Whether you look at very small decentralized cold rooms or very large systems, which are typically also a challenge to be integrated within a building. And for the customer, it's a shift from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. So they really pay per consumption. And so the advantage within this model is that it aligns the incentives for the solution provider and the customer to enhance energy efficiency. So from one end, the customer has the ability to adapt their behavior to consume less cooling or cooling more appropriately. So for instance, if you have an office, you will have the tendency then to close the windows rather than to keep the windows open because your consumption of cooling will go up. And for a solution provider that deploys this solution on the market, for an existing contract, they have the economical incentive or financial incentive, rather to say, to maximize energy efficiency within an existing project, because the higher the energy efficiency, the more profit the company will do. And so what is happening here is that really you shift from a model whereby a company that is able to sell a system in a cheap manner, but then have a customer that faces high operation costs. Here you have a different type of model whereby the selling price of the service, so the consumption price, is enveloping the price of electricity, of cooling consumption, of maintenance, and of implementation. So what does it mean? It means that suddenly the system that is more energy efficient is going to be much more price competitive than a cheaper solution that would be cheaper to buy, but where the operation costs are much, much higher. And we did some analysis there, really some theoretical analysis and also market analysis of on-the-ground data, where it really shows one-to-one that cooling as a service really enables to leapfrog to more appealing solutions. And the interesting part is also from a financial perspective. You will see a slide on this later on. The way to invest into cooling as a service can be really a quite classic manner, like using like a sale-leaseback model or a special purpose vehicle financial structure. So if I jump on the next slide, what is important to mention is some differentiations with existing models on the market. So the first one is, for instance, the ESCO model, so the energy savings company type of model, whereby there, even though it's a very good model, what we've seen typically is that with an existing contract, for companies that are deploying this type of contracts on the market, it sometimes is very challenging to estimate the right savings. And therefore, it leads sometimes to friction between the customer and the solution provider and hurdles the relationship between the two. So it's a model that has been having some bottlenecks to be deployed on the market. Now, another model, of course, is district heating and cooling, which cooling as a service is kind of a decentralized district cooling approach. Of course, district heating and cooling is very appealing also on a efficiency perspective, and it's a very strong model, but sometimes it cannot be implemented in every location. So sometimes you have some geographical constraints, but as well, it's needs a much higher investment deployment from one end. And then you also sometimes have the issue that with a specific location having district heating or cooling, it means that suddenly the customers don't have another choice anymore. So they have to go with that supplier. Whereas here on cooling as a service, it really also enables for the customer to decide, okay, I'm not happy anymore with the service I receive. I'm gonna look for another provider. So it gives this flexibility, so it really removes the risks from the table of the customer. And then one aspect which is not mentioned on this slide is the comparison with leasing. So the differentiation with leasing with the customer buying a solution under leasing is that under leasing, the customer still has the risk of the technology, because at the end of the day, they will own that system. Whereas on cooling as a service, really, there is basically no risk for the customer to engage with this solution. And if I jump on the next slide, very briefly, what are some of the advantages for the key actors involved? So the user, the solution provider, and the financier. I mentioned some of those beforehand, but for the user, it's really direct access to mature solutions which are more energy efficient. They don't need to bring on the table the upfront capital expenditure. They have reduced operating expenses. They have a service which is completely off balance, which also offers some accounting advantages for the customer. They don't have any performance risk or supply chain risks, and they also enable a full outsourcing of the cooling service to the company providing that service, which also enables them to really focus onto their core business. For the solution provider, it's really what we've seen, an ability for these companies to deploy the best-in-class technologies that they have, and also the technologies that they're really certain they can reach the targets in a reliable manner. So looking at greenhouse gas reductions, it's really growing in the direction to deploy solutions that really meet the targets that are predicted. And then as well, what is interesting, and it's not mentioned here, it's also encouraging these companies to go into a circular economy mindset, whereby they're going to be looking at the whole life cycle of this system and trying to maximize as much as they can the living time of this asset, and hence also increase the return on investment of an asset active on the ground. And then for financiers, the interesting part there is really an opportunity to gain access to green funding, but also basically to invest into solutions which are energy efficient, that continuously also comply with upcoming regulations. And thirdly, as well, of course, if it is to decarbonize scope 3 of investments, here you have the opportunity to do that with solutions that are mature on the market and that will perform as expected. Now, very briefly, like this is what I mentioned earlier, one example of how to deploy investments into such technologies. We have here one of the structures that we know is operating on the market is a sale-leaseback mechanism, whereby the technology provider signs a contract of cooling as a service with one or several customers. They can, if needed, have a guarantee provider or an insurer that provides an insurance on the performance that are to be met. And then you have a financial institution that buys and leases back the equipment to the technology provider. And there are different ways of doing that. There is also a sale of receivables that is possible, or another model which is different than this is a special purpose vehicle that I mentioned, where you can really aggregate multiple types of investments within cooling as a service. So within different types of contracts of cooling as a service. Now, some examples briefly, and I'm looking at time, I should still be okay. So here is an example of one of our partners called CARE, which is based in Singapore. And they have activities in Singapore, in India, Malaysia, and in Indonesia, and they're also growing beyond that. They have today about 95% of their portfolio under cooling as a service. And the example you see here is for a large real estate complex that has a shopping mall, a university on board, a school as well, and different businesses. And that customer was looking to upgrade their cooling, but they were hesitant on what solution to go on the market. And also they wanted to have a cleaner cooling approach. So beyond also the refrigerant used, they wanted to have solar panels, but they were really basically thinking that it was not possible to go full green on this type of application. And CARE approached them mentioning, okay, that they could sign a cooling as a service contract, whereby as a customer, they would not do any upfront investment, but they would benefit from the energy efficiency gains that they would receive on their monthly bill, so to say. And so they applied the project, they implemented it a few years back. And from day one of operation, the customer benefited from 20% efficiency gains. And I think today, this plant is actually reaching 30% efficiency gains due to further improvements of CARE on the operation side of the assets, so with digital solutions. And it's a solution that is completely decentralized from the grid. So it's 100% powered by solar panels. And the water that is used to cool the system is also a completely closed circle cooling loop. So it means also that from a circular economy perspective and a sustainability perspective, it's gaining many more points. So if you look at ESG, it's a very strong project. Here is a second type of project, which is in Colombia with an office building. So here as well, the customer was building actually a new building, whereas the one you saw before was a retrofit project. And for this project here, the customer as well was a bit hesitant on what type of cooling to use and what type of solutions, because what you have to know as well is that within that industry, we're having more and more complexities. So as a customer, when you're not an expert in cooling, it starts to be very difficult to know, okay, what type of cooling do I go for? What type of digital solution do I go for? What type of payment system do I go for? It starts to be really complex for a customer. So here, the supplier really embedded this whole solution to the customer. And again, the contract that was used was a per office billing concept, so that each floor that was rented by an office was going to pay a certain fee to receive the cooling. And whenever that renter of the office would change, there would be an agreement that the contract of cooling would shift to the new renter. And so the project today, this one is already active, up and running, and it's saving about 440 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And so energy savings are of 1.2 gigawatt hour per year. And here you have a third example of one of our partners in South Africa, Energy Partners Refrigeration, which again, similar concept. This one is an industrial. So it's food and beverage production company that does actually, you probably know the name, they're called Dr. Oetker, they do frozen food. And as well here, they were expanding the plant and they didn't know for which solution to go. And they chose a contract of cooling as a service with Energy Partners with 100% clean refrigerants, which are, in this case here, it's ammonia. And as you know, also ammonia sometimes is difficult for customers to engage with ammonia because there are some echoes that it might be difficult to maintain and dangerous to maintain. So here you really transition that responsibility to the solution provider who really has the knowledge and the responsibility to do the operation of the plant in a reliable manner. So similar as well, the customer benefited from 20% energy improvements from day one of operation. And they had savings of at least 1,200 CO2 emissions per year. And one example that I'm not showing here, but I could show later on in the Q&A session, it's cooling as a service applied in off-grid cooling rooms for the agricultural sector. So an area where we've seen really a huge amount of demand increase, and actually it's providing a strong solution, is in this application, which is in the agricultural space, where, as you know, like as climate is rising and also temperatures are from one side rising, but you have also a lot of volatility in weather forecasts, smallholder farmers are faced with a lot of risks. And so you have a lot of food spoilage due to a lack of good refrigeration. And cooling as a service applied in small cold rooms solutions provide a very strong offer for the smallholder farmers. But I'll show maybe a slide on this during the Q&A. So within BASE, how have we been active really to support the market? We were active on 4 pillars. The first one was really on building capacity within the market. So it was really supporting a different range of actors and players in the cooling field to share the knowledge on what is cooling as a service and how to deploy it within their operations. So we have today an alliance of cooling as a service with more than actually 80 members on board. Then we also created specific tools to help these companies accelerate the transition from selling assets to selling services. So what are those tools? They are, for instance, the standardized contracts. There are also pricing model. How do you shift really from selling assets to selling like recurrent revenues? What are certain of the risks behind? So risk mitigation instruments, and as well all of the documentation needed to also share this opportunity to customers. And then we were active on specific projects. So what I mean by there, of course, BASE is not a technology supplier nor a financier, but what we were doing is we ran incubator projects where we selected specific companies at specific geographies, and we guided them through the process of from A to Omega, basically from the alpha to the Omega, to implement cooling as a service in their operations. And then we did a lot of raising of awareness through case studies, webinars, workshops, and podcasts. And now one important point to mention is, of course, this cooling as a service initiative was funded by a philanthropy based in California called ClimateWorks under the Clean Cooling Collaborative. And the funding of this project has now closed. However, together with the partners, we have been discussing what should be the next step within the markets to keep the private sector engaged and growing in implementing cooling as a service. And what we discussed and agreed with the partners is to launch what we call today the Global SET Alliance, which Janie mentioned briefly in the introduction. So this is the Servitization for Energy Transition Alliance. And the goal is to continue acting within the 4 pillars that you saw in the previous slide to help the market adopt this model and to continue having this market dynamism established across geographies and industries. So there you go. Maybe I stop here, and Janil or Andrew, I give you back the screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Dimitris. And it's always a pleasure to chat with such an expert as yourself in this field, especially in an area that's gained so much momentum internationally. And we see you certainly tapped into your wealth of experience and given us a lot to think about. Now, I know looking at the list of attendees, your presentation certainly would have piqued the interest of a lot of our stakeholders, ranging from project developers in the construction sector to potential cooling as a service utility providers, to the financial sector, which could provide funding both on the supply and demand side. And while you were speaking, the questions have in fact come streaming in. So let's not delay the process and we can dive straight into some of them. So Dimitris, one of the underlying themes of your presentation is that these models have been very successful in other parts of the world. And I think you made that point very well when you pointed out that the cooling as a service should be a little higher up on your servitization graph. So one of the first questions from the audience is very to the point and asks, what makes these investments attractive to financial institutions?
Yes, so the point that is very attractive to financial institutions is, from one end, the return. So the return on these projects are quite secure. So what we've seen also on markets, it varies on the type of financier that you are. But for instance, we have a private equity firm in Latin America. They are noting between 12 to 16% returns. But then also our aim is, of course, to bring more commercial debt to increase the access to commercial debt for private companies to deploy those solutions. And there really it's a very low risk of achieving those returns for the implementation of the project. And then on the other side is also a very high grade on ESG. So from a sustainability perspective, you can really score very high. So what we've seen, for instance, with that project in Latin America, as you know, in South Africa, as you know, South Africa, their grid is mainly coal powered. And also faces a lot of blackouts due to the high temperatures and to the demand of the grid. And here, the solution implemented really basically ticked all the boxes. So it's a solution that is completely solar powered, using 100% clean natural refrigerants. So it's from a climate perspective, it's shooting all the points basically. And what we see really, it's also the ability from one end for the financial sector, if let's say they want to take that role and they have the capacity also to take their role, to influence the solution provider. So for instance, a solution provider will ideally want to raise more funding for additional projects, and there they can really set the criteria and to say, okay, if you want to reach that target or receive that additional amount of funding, you can do so, but these are our new criteria and you have to fit those criteria. So it really gives also control to the financier. Whereas today, what is happening is a customer would like to buy a new system. They're going to raise, they're going to collect debt. Sure, that customer has a solid financial profile. Let's say if we take a big supermarket chain or a big hotel chain. However, their decision process on selecting the right technology is, of course, triggered on knowledge, and they're not the best position to take the best solution in class. So you really also kind of enable a high ESG grading.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Dimitris. And I think you've really highlighted the importance of having sessions like this in terms of deepening all of our knowledge in terms of all the factors that go into these decisions. Now, you circled back to South Africa, and I think from your slides, you gave a very excellent example of a food and beverage producer, which was able to finance the entire project because cooling as a service had cut their upfront costs. So from the questions we're seeing, and the theme of the questions we're seeing in the Q&A, is it that you're also seeing that these savings in capital expenditure can reduce the overall construction cost for new projects to the point where it allows more construction projects to qualify for financing?
Very good question. I would say yes, absolutely, because from one end, for the customer per se, the customer that will be signing a cooling as a service contract, they are the expert of their own business, so they know better what they need where as a construction plan. So then that relationship with the customer, with the financier, can really also be more healthy. And then from the cooling as a service provider, they as well, they know very well like how they need to implement what. So I would say from an investment perspective, it's much more efficient on how the capital is deployed for what activities of construction.
Fantastic. And I think that South Africa example also is intriguing because it spoke to commercial applications for cooling as a service. So I think this begs the question, which industries you see as strong candidates for cooling as a service? And we also have some other questions in the Q&A on that theme in terms of whether or not there are applications for the residential sector in particular.
Mm-hmm. So actually, we see really strong potential for a range of industries within cooling as a service. From the one side, really on the big B2B applications, whether it is for instance, data centers. Data centers are an application that consumes huge amounts of cooling. But also what is particularly appealing is that the cooling is rather constant. So if you look also at financing such applications, it means that the revenues and the payments per month are very, very stable. So that's one. Then, of course, public buildings, offices, hospitals, schools, but also hotels. And for instance, on those applications that I mentioned where you have a potential volatile usage of cooling, what you can do there is really also define the contract so that you have with the customer a mixture of a fixed fee and a variable fee. And the fixed fee is agreed also between the solution provider and the financier so that it's appealing enough to reduce the risks of deploying the financing. Because of course you don't want suddenly an investment to have a customer that doesn't pay for the invoices anymore or doesn't use cooling. So there is really kind of an equilibrium to be made where we've been receiving the questions in the past that, okay, but is it fair to the customer? And actually, if you look at certain types of customers, it's very fair, because if you look at supermarkets, they also do have a well-known amount of cooling that they need to run their business. So if suddenly they use less cooling, it's potentially because the supermarket is well, not operating anymore. So we also, what we advise there with solution providers is when they engage on a first step on cooling as a service, to look at applications and customers where they are really well aware of the profile of that customer and what type of contract to implement with that customer. And then the last point you mentioned on residential, we've also seen their applications of cooling as a service, and notably as well in markets where you would think that it would not work. So we actually wrote a case study on an implementation in Tanzania for air conditionings in the residential sector. And there as well, what we've seen is that it basically enables to remove, it's a market dynamism that enables for customers to say no to bad refrigerants and inefficient systems. So it's interesting because for sure, from one end, you need the policies to stop the bad systems from entering into a market. But as we know, we sometimes also have the challenge of illegal markets where people have access to certain solutions and they buy it really cheap. But again, like the operation and maintenance is very high. So here in the residential sector, we have the opportunity to provide this type of solutions, which makes it more financially viable to the customer as well.
Dimitris, I think you touched on a lot of important points, including the potential market for off-takers. But I think you started off by taking us into the realm of what these contractual arrangements would look like. And I think that is something that is really important to financiers as well as potential investors in these types of arrangements. So that segues to some of the other questions we're seeing as a theme in the Q&A box. Could you tell us a little bit more about how these cooling as a service contractual arrangements are typically structured? For example, what's the usual term or the length of the contract, and what would these pricing models look like?
Yeah, so the contract type really depends on the type of application that we look at. So for instance, if it's a large system that is deployed for a data center, or even for instance for an airport, the contract length is going to be longer, so typically between 7 to 15 years. And also, let's say the contract is going to be more complex. So there's going to be many more clauses that are going to hedge risks for the supplier to have, let's say, a solid relationship with the customer, but as well to ensure that the system is really off balance from the balance sheet of the end customer. Because what we want to avoid is to, at the end of the day, have what we call an embedded lease for the end customer, which in some contracts, which we have seen are not properly designed, are sometimes heading towards. And why we want to avoid this is because ideally we don't want for the solution, for the hardware to belong to the customer at the end of the contract lifetime. Not because, let's say, if the customer wants it, we add a clause in the contract whereby the customer has the ability to request that and to purchase the equipment at the end of the contract lifetime. But ideally, when the equipment stays under the ownership of the solution provider, it also means that they can continuously improve their solution. And at the end of the contract lifetime, whether it is 7 or 12 years, they can come back to the customer and say, okay, we have here an improvement that we would like to implement, and the new contract will be XYZ and of a price of delta. And then the customer has, again, the power to decide yes or no in which way do they want to go. And so if you look at smaller applications, like for instance, we applied cooling as a service as well for off-grid cold rooms in the agricultural sector. There, the contract with the end customer is much simpler. So they have actually, it looks like a hostel contract. So it means that they come with a crate of produce in front of the cold room, and they pay per night that they store the crate of vegetables. And this again gives a lot of flexibility from the customer side. And typically it's also customers that are very reluctant to engage with new applications. And here it gives them the opportunity to say, okay, I'm going to try it for 1, 2, 3 days. And if I receive more revenues as a farmer because I'm able to reduce my my crop spoilage, then it's going to make sense for me to continue using that service of cold rooms. And what we've seen is really, like, from an impact perspective, all of the farmers that have started using this service, they continue using it. So actually, if you look at one system, one of these systems, typically they cost about, I would say, 30 to 35,000 US dollars. So it's a small investment, but ideally you have a lot deployed in a particular country. And the payback is of close to 1.5 to 2 years. So the payback to basically be on a profit margin of growing thereafter, it's extremely appealing. And the way that this approach is done is to have customers implementing or farmers storing a variety of crops that are basically available throughout the entire year. So it also means, as a provider operating that cold room, you have almost no risk of not having customers storing into your cold room.
Dimitri,
so
sorry.
Yeah,
please
go ahead.
Yes, please go on.
No, I was just going to mention that so the contract with the customer is extremely simple. It's a daily contract. So so you have both extremes.
No, that's great. And I really do appreciate you bringing that example to the table in the context of a country like ours, where farming is usually done on a small scale and it's really cash intensive, especially as there is a greater push for us now to expand food production. And it does demonstrate that there are opportunities for clients throughout the entire spectrum, from small and micro enterprises all the way up to larger projects. And that actually takes us to a very specific question coming from Mali Kwamina, which is, how do SMEs access servitization contracts funding for agrivoltaic projects for the source of energy for CAAS, for cooling as a service?
A very good question. So there, I would say, ideally, what we've seen is access to funding is done in a variety of manners. And that's because also the market is currently getting more mature in that direction. So what I mean by that is that the companies we're in touch with, they typically have a mixture of funding that comes from private equity funds, VC funds, grants, and also debt. So it's really a mixture. What we are now looking to do is really to raise the percentage of capital that is available through debt, so that really also banks see the opportunity to fund such applications, because again, what is missing right now is data. So we from our side know that these applications work because we've seen it really closely with companies we support, in Nigeria, in India, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and we've received also echoes in a lot of other countries of providers wanting to go in this direction. And so ideally, what we are doing now is to collect the data that these applications are indeed working as we know they are, and make this data available to the financial sector, so that they can really see transparently that it's a low risk opportunity to support.
Thank you so much. And Dimitris, I think one of the underlying themes of your presentation as well has been that we all as stakeholders need to be thinking about cost versus benefit of these projects, not from a short-term but a long-term perspective. But of course, a major variable in those calculations is energy prices. Now, the world has certainly seen some violent fluctuations in the energy market over the last few years, and Trinidad and Tobago is not immune to that. And there are, of course, no guarantees of stability going forward. So from your perspective, how do you think we can protect cooling as a service contracts from these fluctuations in energy prices?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also something we see now, of course, across Europe with the situation. So we have extremely volatile energy prices. Here, the model of cooling as a service is really indexed to the energy price. So we basically remove the risk from the supplier of the energy price fluctuation. However, because the price of energy is embedded into the solution, that still makes sense to increase energy efficiency. However, because the price to the end customer is indexed, that price risk of energy is transferred to the end customer. So there is really also, which we believe it's absolutely fair because it shouldn't be the risk of the provider or the financier on the fluctuating energy price. However, what is interesting there is, of course, for applications that are off-grid. So for instance, we've seen the ones powered by solar energy. There you remove that risk completely. Or another solution we've seen as well in some of the applications that we're looking at in Europe is for customers that have already a contract as a virtual PPA, so a virtual power plant agreement, where they have a certain set of price of electricity, which is set for the next few years. And so these type of customers then also, especially if you look at the example here in Europe, where we've been having extremely volatile prices, it becomes appealing because it also means that you don't have to worry to each week or each month have to index the price of your service. So these are like some of the approaches we've seen.
And sticking with that theme in terms of the contracts, do you wish to speak a little bit more in terms of other contractual risks and how these might typically be managed?
Yes, well, you have from contractual risks, you have from one side the risk for the end customer. So let's say if the solution is not as expected. Let's say if you're a hotel and suddenly the cooling breaks down, there is a clause in the contract that says if as a customer you sign the cooling as a service contract that also has a fixed fee, but the service is not working, you're not paying for that service. So it's it really removes the investment risk and the technology risk from the customer. From the financier that is involved in that relationship, of course, there is a clause there with the provider that the provider needs to keep paying the financier, even if a solution stops working or if a customer stops paying. And so for this, there are different ways for also a provider to hedge their risk. So either they engage with a diversified portfolio, which we highly recommend. But of course, it's not possible to do when you just start on doing cooling as a service. But down the road, when you start to have multiple customers, we highly recommend to have a diversification of type of customers so that if one customer stops paying or reduces their amount of cooling, you still have other customers that are maybe going to increase their rate of cooling demand. So for instance, if we look at the COVID situation, one of our partners had hotels or let's say offices that were completely empty, but then they had also data centers, libraries, airports where the consumption had to be maintained. And for instance, that is also a point I can slightly elaborate. For airports that are in very hot climates, even during situations of COVID, they had to keep using their cooling. And why? Because they have equipment inside their infrastructure which are very sensitive to hot and humid temperatures. So those airports that were using cooling technologies that were inefficient through COVID, they had extremely high bills. So now they become also a very important type of customer and appealing customer to offer cooling as a service. Other risks also face, for instance, of course, the risk of the customer going default or bankrupt. And so there, one way to edge this is to add a guarantor or an insurer that then comes in case the customer goes default. But typically what we recommend there as well is, because of course, all these ways of edging the risk, they make the cooling as a service offering slightly more expensive. So what we advise for the first customers is to have customers that are with a well-known risk profile. And typically what we think is a very interesting approach is for a solution provider to engage with a financier that knows a typical customer. And so that financier will very well know the profile, the risk profile of that customer. So it becomes almost kind of a no-brainer to deploy this type of solution.
Dimitris, thank you so much for that. And I realize that time is against us, but I think we have time for perhaps just one last question. And I think this goes to the heart of the issues that our audience would be interested in. So we know that one of the current challenges with ESG right now is the metrics for measuring positive environmental impact. We know globally that there isn't a uniform approach among countries, sectors, or even financial institutions on how we quantify or measure these impacts. But this is something, of course, we all have to address our mind to, whether as financial institutions developing lending policies or ethical investors looking for the right financial instrument. So can you perhaps speak to some of the options for measuring these environmental impacts and how banks and investors can factor these into their decision making?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very important point. Completely agree also with the person that raised that question. So the good thing with cooling as a service is that the solution provider providing that service has to be very accurate in measuring the amount of service that they deploy. Because if, let's say, they deploy more than they're measuring, they're losing money. If they're supplying less than what actually they're measuring, the customer is not going to be happy and is going to notice it. So they have to be quite accurate in how they measure it. And today there are solutions that are on the market to do that. Some companies have it in-house, but there are also outsourced solutions for that. So it's really these digital aspects, so IoT solutions on the market connected to the cloud that also offer a very transparent way of measuring this. And of course, we have now also new technologies that are coming onto the market, like blockchain technologies, which also enable really to have a measurement which is 100% not falsified or very difficult to falsify. So that's from one end. And then from the, so it's data that then becomes very transparently available to the financier. But then what we've seen also is that the financial sector can actually also influence the market. And what I mean by that is, for instance, if they sign or deploy capital with a solution provider, they can also argue with that solution provider and mention, look, company X, if you actually outperform the targets that you're aiming for, we could, as a financier, slightly reduce the cost of capital that we're providing the capital for you for. So there it's really also kind of, again, pushing the market even further to achieving the climate target goals. So we really see like a responsibility on both sides, which can push the market forward.
Dimitris, I think you've scratched the surface, but really given us a lot to think about in this conversation. And it's unfortunate that time has run away from us, but I do anticipate us having some further discussions. And thankfully, the team has advanced that they will be putting out more of these presentations as we go along. But I'll say that if you've left us with nothing else, it is that sustainable cooling certainly appears to be a global industry and a growth industry at that. And you did touch on the fact that this is a $230 billion per year market over the next 30 years. So there are opportunities both for financiers as well as project developers to both pursue their financial goals as well as their ESG goals. So it can be a win-win for all of us, I think. So Dimitris, it certainly has been a pleasure chatting with you this afternoon where you are. And I'm positive you'll be receiving a lot of follow-up emails after we're done today. So now I'll hand over to our project manager, Anselm Simon, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Many thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. So welcome. Well, thank you very much to our panelists and representatives of government, financial institutions, and our valued stakeholders for attending this session this morning. It's truly my pleasure to come at the end of this excellent webinar, which featured the concept of sustainable financing mechanisms and models. And as Andrew would have said, it's the first in a series as we continue to promote green cooling in Trinidad and Tobago. You know, this presentation is timely as the project progresses towards catalyzing market change in Trinidad and Tobago that we look forward to, towards the utilization of sustainable technologies in our cooling sector. And it also comes just before the launch of our 2 district cooling projects in Trinidad, which would serve as a local example of cooling as a service mechanisms as described. You know, these initiatives would greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address the utilization of ozone-depleting substances while providing lucrative opportunities for investors, project developers, financial institutions within the context of Trinidad and Tobago and the region. At this time, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dimitri, Carmitos, and Base for the presentation and insights as it relates to the topic of sustainable financing mechanisms, and for sharing his wealth of experience related to the cooling as a service model. I know that the concepts covered, like the challenges in the cooling sector, servitization, financial structures, and of course, the support of the global examples that were provided were invaluable. I'd also like to thank the team from UNDP, Ministry of Planning and Development, for all the hard work in preparing for this webinar, which is the first in a series focusing on financing models. And I'd also like at this time to take the opportunity to thank our valued stakeholders and attendees for their attendance and interaction at this webinar, and for your continued support as we continue to not only contribute towards a sustainable cooling path for Trinidad and Tobago, but also the world. You all have my gratitude. Thank you very much.